So do you want to learn how to start taking photos with a DSLR camera? Well, then you've clicked on the right video, because today I'm going to teach you just that in under 5 minutes. Well, I'm going to try my best to. So let's get started with this video after the, I don't know if we have an intro. Woo! Alright, welcome everyone. So if you're watching this video, you probably want to learn how to start taking photos with a DSLR. You might have one lying around at home, maybe your mom's or dad's camera, one you don't use. You want to, bump up your Instagram feed a little bit. If you're stuck in quarantine, you got nothing to do, so I'm going to teach you the basics of photography. I'm going to go over 3 main points: the camera settings in manual mode, the importance of lighting, and importance of good composition. So if you have a DSLR camera, you have a manual mode. Manual mode may seem very complicated to use, so I'm going to break it down to you so that you can start using manual mode and taking a lot better photos. So the main thing that you need to understand is the exposure triangle. So the exposure triangle is made up of 3 things: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So you need to take all of these things into consideration when shooting in manual mode. So ISO is basically the camera's sensitivity to light. So when they used film cameras, it was kind of like the film you had a certain sensitivity to light. So ISO 100, ISO 800, But nowadays with our more advanced cameras, you can change this ISO within the camera. So the higher the ISO, the more sensitive the camera is to light, which means it'll let more light in, the sensor will let more light in, but this can cause for grain if you don't have, if you go too high. And with a lower ISO, obviously, it lets in less light, but the image is a lot sharper. When shooting photos, usually you want to opt around shooting with a low ISO. So the second thing you need to understand is aperture. So aperture is kind of the rings within the camera. It's a bit confusing. A wide aperture is a low number. A low f-stop is what you call it. F-stop is kind of the f-stop is like the rubric, if you will, for the aperture and how much light the lens lets in. You want to keep the aperture pretty wide and the aperture number, f-stop, pretty low when shooting portraits, because then you get that nice blurry effect in the background. When shooting landscape photos, however, you want to have the aperture a bit higher, the f-stop a bit higher, so a bit narrower, and then more of the image will be in focus. Also, it's important to note that the lower the f-stop, the more light the camera lets in, because the aperture rings, they open up wider, and the higher the f-stop, the narrower the aperture ring and the less light the lens lets in. The third one is shutter speed. So shutter speed is basically how quickly the sensor opens and closes. Shutter speed when shooting moving objects, you want a high shutter speed because the lens opens and closes very quickly. And when shooting still objects or landscape, you can have a lower shutter speed where you maybe have the camera on the tripod. So when you're shooting at a lower shutter speed, sensors open for a lot longer, letting in more light. But then again, if there's movement in the frame, this will become blurry if you're not on a tripod. But a low shutter speed is great for landscape photos where you're shooting on a tripod. And when you're shooting portraits, you can shoot at maybe 250th of a second, which is a pretty good speed. You still let in a decent amount of light, but you kind of freeze the frame a lot better. I know that was quick, but hopefully you understand the basic of the triangle. If you don't yet, then look it up or kind of rewatch this and slowly adjust it in your camera settings. Yeah, let's move on to the next thing, which is lighting. I would just recommend shooting outside in natural light. Use the sun to your advantage. You can take some amazing photos, even in harsh sunlight. Most people don't like harsh sunlight. If you expose it right, using the tips I just told you before, with shutter speed, ISO, and aperture, you can get amazing photos. If you want to go for a bit of a softer look, you can take photos in the shade outside. That's also really nice and exposed for your subject. And yeah. So on to the last one, maybe even the most important one when you've nailed the first 2. which is composition. Composition is so important in photography. It's one of the ways you can tell a story. You show what you want to show. One of the main things you've probably heard it before, even if you're a noob, is the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds basically is just a grid on where you want to place your subject. Sometimes you want to frame your subject right in the middle, sometimes you want to frame off the side. Another thing that is great for making more attractive photos is leading lines. So here's an example of leading lines. A lot of photographers use leading lines because they pull the attention into your subject. So these lines lead towards the subject and drag your eye from that line to the subject in the photo. Yeah, so I recommend using leading lines as, you know, have it in your head like, oh, can I use this as a line to draw towards the subject? But you don't want to overdo it, or you want to make sure that these leading lines are actually leading to your subject and not like crossing perpendicularly or anything like that, because that just distracts from the photo. You want to keep it as, well, simple as possible, but you want to attract the viewer's attention to your subject, which you're trying to focus on. Hopefully I've covered the basics. I don't know if, hopefully this helps. If you have any more questions, leave it in the comments below. But hopefully you can start you know, experimenting with manual mode and taking better photos. So the key things: shoot at a low f-stop or a wide f-stop for portraits. You get a nice blurry background. Make sure you're thinking of composition and framing your subject within the photo. Use leading lines to direct your viewer's attention to the subject in the photo. And then, of course, remember the importance of lighting. Always make sure your subject is lit properly, and, you know, take photos outside when you're starting out, because that just makes things a lot easier for you. And if you have not such a professional camera, it can handle the bright light outside a lot better, because then you can shoot at a lower ISO, as I mentioned before. So if you like this video, make sure to give it a big fat thumbs up. If you aren't subscribed already, make sure to subscribe down below, and make sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. See you in the next one. Woo!